Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Keto Answers podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony GUSTIN, and it's my job to get to the bottom of the ketogenic diet and get you the answers you need to reach the levels of health you want. This episode, we have Leanne Vogel. Leanne is a friend of mine, and she's the author of the best-selling book, The Keto Diet. She has an insanely helpful YouTube channel with just massive amount of content. She also has a podcast called the Keto Diet Podcast, which we've had a blast on a few times ourselves. Leanne is a content machine. You can find the majority of her work surrounding ketogenic diet at healthfulpursuit.com. In this episode, we talk about everything ketosis, including the easiest way to get started on a ketogenic diet, how ketosis affects women's health and hormones specifically, and what types of food you should really be eating on a ketogenic diet. I love every conversation I have with Leanne. She's super knowledgeable and really helpful, especially when it comes to women's health and ketosis. There's tons of useful nuggets all over this chat, so tune in and hope you enjoy. Before we get to the episode, I wanted to chat about our sponsor, Perfect Keto. Perfect Keto is all about making a ketogenic diet healthy and accessible. Whether you're reading all of our online guides or articles or enjoying Perfect Keto's exogenous ketones or any other keto-friendly products, everything you need to make keto work for you is at perfectketo.com. I know what you're thinking. Hey, aren't you the founder of Perfect Keto? Yep, that's right. And all of my insanely high standards have been put into making each and every product. My background as a functional medicine clinician helps me craft the cleanest and healthiest possible products and the best information about the ketogenic diet. Head on over to perfectketo.com to learn anything you need to know about the ketogenic diet. And if you've never tried any of our products before, feel free to use the code KETOPODCAST for 20% off your first order. With that being said, let's get into the show. All right, Leanne, thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is awesome.
Yeah, so I figured that when I started a ketogenic diet friendly podcast, you were on a very short list of people to get on the show. So thank you for being on.
Whoa, I'm super honored. That's awesome. Thank you so much.
I mean, you're one of the only people who have really dedicated in the last few years in putting out a massive amount of content and helping tons of people. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah. It's been a crazy 4 years. It's nuts how much the ketogenic diet has morphed over the last 4 years. It was nothing online 4 years ago, just nothing. So it's been neat. The transition. So how
did you start your journey with the ketogenic diet? I know that, if anybody knows any of your stuff, you've gone through a lot nutritionally and health wise in the past. Kind of want to brush on that a little bit.
You bet. So I was a vegan many years ago. And at that point, I went off hormonal birth control. I learned that it wasn't so good for me when I was studying holistic nutrition about 11 years ago. And that kind of started the whole rigmarole and how I ended up finding a ketogenic diet years later. It had been 6 years since I had had a period. Because I'd gone off hormonal birth control, I was on the wrong diet. There were a lot of different reasons, but I found keto in a place where I had been on hormonal therapy. So I was taking estrogen and progesterone. It wasn't bioidentical. So I was just regular hormone therapy and I'd gained a lot of weight. And my naturopath said, well, have you heard of a low carb diet? I said, you're crazy. How am I supposed to be an athlete and eat low carb? Those two don't match. And then one of my girlfriends had just started a ketogenic diet and said that it was awesome. And I looked into it and I thought, you know what? What's the worst thing that can happen? And after learning what not to do on a ketogenic diet, especially for women, I was able to tweak a couple of things and I got my period back after 9 months. And at that point, it had been about 7.5 years of me not menstruating. So it was quite a journey to get there. And now it's been over 2 years that I've, ovulated and had all these amazing things with my body. And it feels nice to be in that space. Any women listening that haven't had their period in that long, it's quite frustrating. So yeah, keto really helped me in that regard.
Yeah, it's an amazing story. And I'm sure we'll dig in a little bit further, but question, why vegan before and are you vegan now doing a ketogenic diet?
Oh, that's a great question. I will never be vegan again. Never say never, but I think that's fair to say. I switched over to vegan primarily because I couldn't afford good food. I moved out of my house when I was fairly young, when I was 16, and I was putting myself through school and had a full-time job, and I couldn't afford meat. And so it was kind of a necessity at that point. And then when I started learning more about nutrition, I kind of went down the path of vegan is healthier for everyone's bodies. And that's kind of the path that I went down until my husband, when I met him about 10 years ago, he started collecting pictures of me sleeping all over the house. And I napped, I slept. I couldn't go through a whole day without sleeping. I would usually nap in my car at work. And my husband has a folder of Leanne sleeping. That's what it's called. And that was my vegan life of just always sleeping. So I transitioned out of vegan just because I knew that it just wasn't good for my body anymore. But I've met a lot of people that combine vegan with keto, and it can be done. It's just not something that I will do.
Okay. So did you make that transition at the same time, going from vegan to keto, or was it a gradual approach over a course of a couple of years?
Yeah. So when I was vegan up until a couple of months before I started the ketogenic diet, I switched from vegan to paleo and then paleo to keto. And I would say that transition was about 3 months. But from paleo to keto, it was like the next day. I'm doing this and I've never looked back.
So from a paleo diet, you still keep a lot of those principles intact from a paleo type of diet, don't you?
I really do. At first, I kind of ditched all of the things that I knew about nutrition out the window when I started keto. And I just said, I'm going to follow all the macros. I'm not going to care so much about food quality, and I'm just going to do this thing. And back then, that's really the only way there was to keto, of just pay attention to your macros, eat all of the processed meats that you want, it'll be fine. And so I did that and it didn't work. So then I kind of backpedaled, but now I definitely incorporate paleo principles in the ketogenic diet. And that's where I found the most success.
It's funny that you say that, especially when it comes to weight loss. There's a lot of people, so we have this big Facebook group, and even people emailing me or reaching out through social media asking, hey, I'm not getting the results I want. Whether that be from weight loss or inflammation reduction or mental clarity. And the first question I ask is, are you eating real food? They're usually like, well, I have cheese sticks dipped in sour cream, fried with bacon. Does that count? I'm like, no, it does not count.
No, that's not a thing.
So I totally can relate to that. So you mentioned a lot about how you weren't having normal menstruation, and that came back after a course of about 9 months. Is that something that you worked closely with your naturopath about, or was it a side effect more so of the ketogenic diet?
Yeah, at first I worked with the naturopath just to kind of start on the ketogenic diet. And I did that for 6 months, like what I was talking about with the processed meats and just going that route. And I ended up losing a lot of hair. My thyroid got even worse. I've always had hypothyroid issues. I wasn't sleeping. I'd gone 6 days without sleep. And so I switched to not forcing myself to fast. That was a big one. When I was hungry, I was going to eat, and I started incorporating a thing that I like to call carb ups into the mix. And while I was doing that, I switched to working with an orthomolecular doctor just to start looking at the different nutrients that I was lacking. I found that I was very, very low in vitamin A, vitamin D. Most of my fat soluble vitamins were quite low. So for me, it was really about boosting up my ability to digest a lot of the things that I was eating, because although I was eating all of the fats, I wasn't necessarily being able to process them that my body probably should have. So I think it was in conjunction with, giving those 3 steps a try, incorporating the carb ups into my already ketogenic diet, not forcing myself to fast and eating when I was hungry, as well as looking at the different nutrients that I was lacking. And really all I did with the nutrients piece is take a bunch of vitamin A and get out in the sun more. That was kind of my takeaway for what I worked with the orthomolecular doctor on. And then from those changes that I made, it took myself 9 months to get my period back. But I mean, you could even see, I went to the naturopathic doctor when I was working with her, and then the orthomolecular doctor, and we tested my blood work every month. So I have a huge chart on my computer of, what my cholesterol was doing and how all of that was transitioning. It was really cool to see, my HDL especially was quite low when I started the ketogenic diet, and ended up being, a nice level, and triglycerides went down quite substantially. So yeah, those were sort of some of the outcomes that I saw.
Any other markers that you were tracking that changed significantly?
Oh yeah, DHEA was nuts how high that got. It was very, very, very low. My cortisol has taken some time. I'm just starting to get a handle on my cortisol. I was also, writing a book during this time and building a business. So the cortisol took some time. And I think regardless of what diet you're on, taking steps with your diet, outside of your diet, even to help your cortisol is a big one. So little things like not going to bed with my phone and getting blue light blocking reading glasses. So if I am staying up late, I am trying to block some of that light, and just extra things. I started being more mindful of this. And I think, with the ketogenic diet, I just had more time because you're not eating as much to start delving a little bit deeper into my own life and what I wanted for myself. So cortisol was a big one. DHEA, estrogen was a huge one that increased quite substantially for me. Progesterone. And I think this all really came from, when I first started the ketogenic diet, or right before, it almost looked like somebody had, had all my hormones lined up and just turned off a light switch. Like they were all just really, really low and in need of some love and care. And for me, what we saw is that every time my cholesterol increased, my sex hormones would increase too. And so then it became a goal of, how high can I get my cholesterol to get my sex hormones up? And, I never thought I would say something like that, but I actually thrive in that quote unquote higher zone, where when I go to a natural, a normal doctor, they're like, oh, your cholesterol's high. You should look at lowering that. I'm like, heck no, right. I'm not touching that. That's where the magic happens. For me.
A lot of that is precursor to sex hormones. And also, I mean, if it's in the absence of like high inflammation or inflammatory markers, which I'm sure on a ketogenic diet for you, did you track CRP or ESR and any of these things?
Yes, I did. I did the CRP, and that was tough because we realized it was nuts that made me really inflamed. So now my ketogenic diet does not have nuts, very limited seeds, and no eggs. So that was.
And what type of testing did you do to discern that nuts, seeds, and eggs were a problem?
Well, it was not so much testing as opposed to just playing around with it. I would go in month over month, and we would test the inflammation markers. And then the doctor would say, like, what have you been eating? And I'm like, I totally know it's the eggs. So for me, it was just kind of looking at those foods such as, for a lot of people, it's dairy. And for me, it's dairy as well, but I've known that for a while. Nuts, could be seeds, eggs. Other people react to even nightshades, which can cause issues. So I kind of looked at each one and removed one food for a month. And then we would look at my markers and see if they were any better. So when he said, your inflammation's not getting any better, Leanne, like, okay, this month I'm going to remove nuts, and then we'll test again and we'll see how it goes. And then it was reduced quite substantially. I'm like, okay, cool. So then we'd rock that for a little while, and then the inflammation wouldn't be going down as much as we'd want. So then I'd remove another thing. And I think it really depends on the type of person you are. I've been quite intuitive with my body for quite some time. So I usually know when I shouldn't be eating a food, and I do anyways, just like slight little things that happen. But if you're not that type of person, it might be beneficial to get allergy testing done so you can kind of get a feel. I just wouldn't recommend, the prick testing is cool if you have an actual allergy. Like I'm anaphylactic to peanuts. So when they test my skin with peanuts, of course it's going to show. But for any of those, subtle allergies, it can get a little bit more complicated. Right.
And there's definitely a difference between allergies and intolerances. And I think people can react to foods without being like actually clinically allergic to them. So that's something to be mindful as well. So this is a great approach that you do, very individualized tinkering with yourself. So you were noticing that the inflammation was going down step by step. When you add these foods back in, like you said, you knew dairy was a problem. Inflammation can creep up in people in different ways. Did you notice any sort of symptom that you had, whether that be gut problem or skin issues, anything like that? Sluggish energy. What were the things that you noticed that were the intuitive markers for you?
This is going to be the strangest thing, but I know this is a thing for other people because I've had this conversation with others. The index finger on my left hand hurts. That is my sign that I ate something I shouldn't have. And for some people, other things, I know that, if I have dairy, I get acne on my forehead. And it happens very quickly. Even if I have certain types of alcohol, I'll get acne on my neck, like in the middle of my neck. If I do nuts, it's on acne on my jaw line. So for me, the different types of foods show up in different places, but it's usually acne related. And also the finger. And the finger is really great too, because it tells me whether or not I've had an inflammatory oil. So if we go to a restaurant, we went the other day and I said like, what kind of oil do you cook with? And they're like, oh yeah, we have beef tallow. And I'm like, what? That's awesome. No, they totally didn't. There was something else in that fryer because my finger was so inflamed I could barely move it. And it's just the one finger. So for other people, it can be other things, whether it be, you know, just like gut pain, or maybe it's tightness in different other joints. For my husband, Kevin, we did a little dairy experiment where he went years without eating dairy. And then my sister got him hooked on lactose-free cheese. He started eating it all the time. And at first it was fine, but you know, he'd clear his throat every once in a while, or he had an itchy scalp a little bit on one side. And I just said, hey, babe, these things are happening. He's like, no, that's not the dairy. I'm like, okay. So I just stopped buying the cheese for 2 weeks. And he tried the cheese again a couple of days ago. Totally reacted to it, hot mess really quickly. And I was like, see, so sometimes it can be a really quick thing if you remove it for a couple of weeks and then try it again. Whereas they really do creep up. And you have to be very mindful and honest with yourself with what's going on with your body.
So this is a good way to interject the point that ketogenic diet is not just if it's your macros diet. And that it has to be such an individualized approach with all the people that you've worked with and all the people that you've helped with all your material. Would you say that this is one of the most common things that people stuck on, maybe just looking at grams of fat or grams of carbohydrate they're eating, and really they should be looking at it as an individualized approach?
Yeah, I would say there's a couple of things that people get stuck on. And the number one thing, like what we already talked about, is the food quality. And I think that ties really much in line with the macro counting and things. It's like, and also the dairy. A lot of people think, you know, on that standard American diet, okay, let's increase fat. And then the first thing they think of is, well, dairy has fat, so I'll just eat the dairy. And then, you know, 80% of their fat intake is, you know, of their calories, maybe 60% of that is all dairy. So I think too, that whole conversation about the food quality is really important and does tie in with the macros. You need to look beyond that because, like you said, when somebody says that they're not having success in the ketogenic diet, my first question also is, okay, what are you eating? And 9 times out of 10, it's a bunch of garbage that isn't really going to help you. Sure, it'll get you into ketosis, maybe, but if your inflammation gets that bad that you're eating foods that you shouldn't, that can even stop you from maintaining a good ketogenic state. Can also stress out your body a bunch, can also lead to, even I've seen blood sugar go crazy when people are eating foods that they shouldn't be eating, and then they can't get into ketosis and they're frustrated and they're like, oh, this diet doesn't work. And it's like, no, wait, just, you know, like have kale and, you know, saute that in coconut oil as opposed to, you know, like you said, a cheese stick wrapped with bacon with sour cream, like 2 very different things.
Yeah, people on Instagram especially get pretty prideful of the ridiculous keto meals. I think it's hilarious sometimes. So yes. You mentioned earlier as well, when you went through this journey, there's a few different things you noticed. One was not fasting excessively. Can you go into that a little bit and how that maybe would play into how people would approach a ketogenic diet and intermittent fasting in particular?
Yeah, I think especially if you're first getting going and you've read like a couple of books and they're like, oh my gosh, keto, now you don't have to eat as much and you can combine fasting. A lot of the books that I read back in 2014 preparing are like, you know, transitioning over to keto and learning as I was doing it, said like fasting is going to help you. It's going to be so great for keto. It'll get you into a deeper ketogenic state. I just thought that if you're not fasting, you're not keto. And I think a lot of people make this mistake when they first get going with keto is like, okay, I'm starting this ketogenic diet and I also have to only eat for 6 to 8 hours a day. So not only are you transitioning over to this diet that is quite different from probably the way that you've been eating, you're also telling yourself that you can't eat during certain periods. And I made the mistake of, you know, being in that diet culture, it's like if it's not hurting or it's not hard, it's probably not working. So it's almost like you want to struggle and you want to have a hard time with things to know that it's working. So in the case of fasting, I don't think there was a day in those first 6 months where I woke up not hungry. Like I was hungry and I wanted to have breakfast, but I didn't allow myself to have breakfast because I thought that's what you did. And that's a mistake I see a lot of people making is what should happen. And what I've seen, you know, people have more success with is if you wake up and you're hungry, have a ketogenic breakfast. It's not a big deal. I would recommend having something along the lines of like greens with eggs and maybe a little bit of bacon or another type of meat. Or having some sort of like fatty tea or bone broth with fat in it or something, as opposed to just forcing yourself to fast when you're hungry. What should be happening is if you wake up and you're not hungry, you don't eat. And you just wait until you're hungry and then you eat. So for me, I was just constantly putting myself to not eat, even though I was hungry, and not allowing myself to eat. And that's a mistake that I see a lot of people make. So it's not like fasting is bad. I think fasting is awesome. But if you're hungry, maybe you should have something. I've also played around with using exogenous ketones to extend my fast. So when I'm on a crazy book tour and there's literally no time to eat. It's not that I don't want to eat. I just don't have the time. I can extend my fast. Even though I am a little bit hungry, I can just take some exogenous ketones and then extend my fast. I don't recommend doing that all the time, just because if you're hungry, you should probably actually, have food when you can, and honor yourself. And I'm talking from, experience in, regulating my hormones, and that's what's worked best for me. But it can be a great tool if you're just really busy and don't have the time.
Yeah, those are some really good points you made, especially that you should be eating when you're hungry. And so like you said, when you switch your diet and use a different energy system, that's a huge stress to your body that it has to adapt to. It's a positive stress generally, but your body can only adapt to so many things at a time. So then if you're also adding the stress of not eating and using different cellular repair mechanisms, you're going to, again, have another stress to deal with. And so another point that I think is relevant to this is that fasting is generally really good for reducing insulin spikes, which has a whole host of benefits, but that shouldn't happen when you have a ketogenic style breakfast like you talked about either. So you're getting a lot of benefits from fasting by just doing a ketogenic diet. And so I do the same thing. I only eat when I'm hungry, but I eat when I'm hungry. And so people ask me like, oh, do you fast? Is it like a 16-8 window? Like, do you do this every day? Is it every other day? Like, whenever I feel like it, like you said, whenever I'm not hungry, which is the majority of time, because usually how my day is set up, I eat a larger meal at the end of the day. So typically in the beginning of the day, I'm not hungry either. And so, yeah, that's one of the things I've noticed that people mess up on a lot too, is they think that these things have to go hand in hand. We said it should be an intuitive approach to your nutrition and listening to your body. If you're hungry, you're hungry. Another thing about food quality is that if you're skipping on that, then it's really hard to find those real signs of hunger because you're not eating real food and getting real nutrients. Are there any things that you've noticed working with people when they try to incorporate fasting at an excessive level that they feel symptom-wise? Is it sluggishness? Is it high inflammation, kind of stress response type of stuff?
That's a good question. Forcing yourself to fast, even when you're hungry. I'm trying to think of, binging. Duh. One of the main things that took me a little bit, I'm like trying to think of the conversations I've had. Yeah, binging is huge. So what I normally see happening is somebody says, very much similar to what you just said, is, do you do the 16-8 thing? And then the 16-8 thing means to most people, I do this every day. This is what I do regardless. This is what I do. And so people will do that and do that and do that. And they'll continue to maybe be hungry in the morning or hungry at night, or maybe not even hungry when they're supposed to be, quote unquote eating. So it just screws up their ability to really listen to their body. And the more you hush your body, usually the louder it gets before it just stops talking to you. And when it gets louder and louder and louder, that's usually when a lot of people will start having food cravings. And all of a sudden you're watching somebody eat pizza and you're like, that looks so good. And it just screws up a lot of your natural ability to understand what your body actually needs. And it's very much like a muscle. If you're not, using that muscle, it gets weaker and weaker, and can also kind of fight back at you and cause you to eat more than you actually want. I know when I was playing around with fasting and doing a 24 window, which means I was fasting for 20 hours and then I'd eat for 4 hours of the day, which I would never ever do again, because it was just so small. I would all out binge for that entire period and be so uncomfortable and so full and just so not in touch with my body. So that's probably one of the main things that I see people doing, is it just goes way off the deep end and a lot of the times that can lead to people just getting completely off their ketogenic diets because they just feel like it's too restrictive.
Right, and it's already so much of a switch to begin with. Another hot button item that I think you are chatting about a lot is carb ups. Can you explain how you approach that and if that viewpoint has changed over the years?
It's so changed over the years. So when I first started the ketogenic diet, I swore off most carbohydrates. I ate about 20 grams of carbs a day. I counted absolutely everything. I was quite a fat burning machine come 6 months from then, but I also had a bunch of issues. So at that 6-month point, I was reading a whole bunch and researching everything. And I happened on more of a cyclical ketogenic practice, which at the time, most people that were cycling through their carbs were bodybuilders, and they were eating a ketogenic diet through the day and then pounding the carbs at night. There was a big thing back then called carb backloading, where you can still go on YouTube and see these big, bodybuilders eating a ketogenic diet. And then after their workout, they go to Krispy Kreme and they get a bunch of donuts and pound them back, and then their muscles get bigger. And so back then that's really all there was. But now things have definitely changed. And, I kind of looked at the two different sides of it. On one side, when we eat carbs in the morning, which is what I used to do before I ate keto, you are further increasing your already elevated glucose and insulin levels. You're probably going to have brain fog, and that's never a good thing. It's an instant stop to your natural morning fat burning processes and other things. And so I said, I think this macro is definitely the answer to what I need. Like perhaps I remove too much of it, but I also don't want to bring it back, because if I eat those carbs throughout the day, I'm going to be dealing with the brain fog and the tendency to want to eat carbs more through the day. And that's how I kind of transitioned over to, okay, well, what would happen if I ate the carbs at night? And so we're not talking about a lot of carbs. If you think of your body, when I'm on a book tour or something, I jump back and forth through the stage. So I'll try to do it just with my voice. But on one side, when you are a glucose burner, you are burning glucose. That is what you do. You're not metabolically efficient. When you start eating keto, your body's like slowly moving over to wanting to burn fat. And it's like, okay, I'm not really sure of this, but we're just going to go with it until you really get into that fat burning mode. When you're in that fat burning mode, it's quite effortless for you to burn fat, but you can also burn glucose quite easily. So you can jump back and forth quite effortlessly once your body gets attuned to being able to burn fat and prefer fat. So what I started doing is in the evening, once a week, when I first got started, it was just once a week, I would have like a small sweet potato with my meal. And I would take out some of the fat from my ketogenic meal for just dinner, and I would put in some of the carbs. So if I were having, a high fat meat like brisket sauteed with bacon grease, I would maybe, choose a chicken thigh without the skin and then put in a sweet potato. So you're kind of taking out some of the fat, putting the carbs in, and then I would eat that carb. I would go about the evening, I would sleep, I would wake up, and I'd be back into ketosis. And I'm like, wait a minute, what? Like I would test my blood ketones, they would be fine, I would feel fine. And so I continued doing that. And I found the more often I did it, the better my hormones responded. And so what I see is if people are, having carb ups, say what I went to is every day. I was highly in fat burning mode. I was still registering ketones about 1.5 to 2.3, depending on how many carbs that I had. I would eat keto all day. And then if I was doing carb ups every day, it was like a small amount of carbs at dinner, like half an apple on a salad. Like that's really all it took. And then the next morning I would feel great. And it was easier for me to fast. I was slowly starting to be able to build more muscle. My sleep quality was getting better. My mood was getting a whole bunch better. So I just continued on that until I got my period back, and then slowly pulled back to the point where now I probably have a carb up maybe once every 2 to 3 weeks.
Okay. So yeah, this is another thing where it's been an adaptation and not a rule. And I think that's really important for people to realize.
Yes.
Also, you're eating a small sweet potato or half of an apple, not gorging yourself on cherry turnovers. So
yes. Like the cherry turnover thing, exactly.
A cheat day where you're doing, a massive amount of inflammatory food that your body has to recover from, over a course of a week.
Yeah, it's great that you mentioned that too, because a lot of people hear me say carb ups and they're like, did she say pound 300 grams of carbs of anything
exactly
we want? And I'm like, nope. I did not say that. I didn't say that. No, we're talking about like a small amount, like maybe cook up half a plantain. Right. Like don't go crazy with it, and always baby step it, because, you know, you're in fat burning mode. You can maintain there. It's best to just start off small, see how you react, and move up if you need. It's worse, you know, if you start off with 300 grams of carbs and then you're like, well, that didn't work. It's like, yeah, well, clearly you're going to feel totally hungover the next day.
A good point you made is that you need to get into a fat burning state, and then your body can have a little bit of metabolic efficiency to switch back and forth. And it's not going to be like the same time if somebody is just starting on a ketogenic diet and they switch over, and the first, say, 3, 4, 5, 7 days are not that great. Well, they probably haven't used fat as a fuel source since they were a baby. And so in that case, it's going to take a little while to upregulate some transporters and some cellular metabolism to be able to use that fat. But once you get that churning, like you said, you should be able to switch back and forth pretty easily. And I notice the same thing with myself. I can, I can eat maybe a little bit of rice, say at dinner, if I'm doing like sushi or something like that. Next day, you know, if I'm not hungry, just fast and do normal ketogenic diet. And by the end of the next day, I'm fully in ketosis again. Whereas if somebody was just starting, they're not going to have that same flexibility, but it's something that your body starts to learn to be able to switch back and forth. And that's something that I think is very underrated in a ketogenic diet, where people, again, think of it as a rule instead of how you eat, you know, should be flexible. You should be able to process carbohydrates if you do eat them. Again, like you said, they should be coming from real foods, but it's not like your body can only do carbohydrate or only do fat. And I think that having that flexibility is super important.
Yeah, it's really frustrating when people think there's only one way to do something.
And there's such a spectrum on all of this stuff. And so I wanted to ask you quick, you're pretty much the queen of keto, and helping, you know, every single woman that has done keto, I feel like has followed your stuff, and it's been fantastic. You've noticed some things here with fasting, carb ups, and a lot of hormonal issues and digesting food. Anything else that you've noticed that women particularly deal with on a ketogenic diet that either they is a myth or is a pitfall that they can fall into pretty easily?
That's a great question. I think the calorie piece is also important to note. When I first started the ketogenic diet, and what a lot of women do is we just, you know, use our dietary goals to kind of influence how we want to approach our calories. And so when I first started the ketogenic diet, I said, well, I want to lose weight with this, so I'm going to eat 1,200 calories. And so I did that for quite a long time with fasting, and that's what caused all of the issues. So I think a better approach, and what I've seen work better, is when you start the ketogenic diet, if you're a volume eater, keep this in mind. Because what a lot of women face, and even men too, is if you like to feel the fullness and you use a bag of Costco size nuts to get full, that's not going to work in your favor. So they do, you know, calories do play a role, but especially if you're a volume eater. But if you don't like to feel the fullness and you're good with just like, hey, I ate, I'm good, then I would just go off how you feel for the first 30 days. I wouldn't test anything. I've seen testing be so detrimental to people's progress, where, you know, they start the ketogenic diet and they're testing their urine, they're testing their blood, they're jumping on the scale 4 times a day, and they're like, why isn't this working? And, you know, all that stress and dietary stress of switching over, as well as the stress of macro counting and tracking and testing, can actually stop you from getting in a ketogenic state. That's what I see a lot of people getting really caught up with, especially if you have a history of dieting. And so you're, you know, applying this 1,200 calorie goal in mind, and you're not eating enough, plus you're trying to transition. It's just all stress, which can stop you from burning ketones. So I think, you know, it's kind of like all things at once of problems, and it all kind of stems off one another. So if you're starting the ketogenic diet, I would just say, set the intention of eating a bunch of fat and lowering your carbs, and do that for like 2 weeks until you get a really solid handle on it. And then start, you know, okay, well, how many calories am I eating today? You know, do I like to feel the fullness? Can I replace some of the nuts and seeds that I'm eating in copious amounts with perhaps, you know, pairing romaine lettuce with high fat things? So I feel the fullness, but it's with a low carb vegetable that's not going to impact much of anything. And then, when you get to 30 days, maybe test your ketones so you're prepared to kind of bend and flex with that. Because a great example is my husband started eating keto when we were on my first book tour event. And he was doing really well and he was making great choices and he was feeling really good. And I was starting to see the benefits quite quickly. And then when we got home, he tested his ketones and his ketones read 0.8. And then he got super upset and he's like, I'm not doing good at this. And there's, I'm just going to quit. And he was doing great. So I think a lot of people just get caught up with the numbers when they don't need to necessarily. I think the most important thing for all of us is to just feel good. That's why most of us start this, is because we just want to feel better. So if you're feeling better, I think the numbers can actually make you feel worse, even though you have the ability to feel better by just not caring as much about those. Now the story changes if you need a therapeutic dose of ketones for your health and it's important, but I think it's baby steps. A couple of months in, you can get really geeked out by the numbers and have a good sense of your body and tweak things and feel really good about it. But when you're first starting out, it could be just maybe too much. And that's what I see a lot of women doing time and time again, and just self-destructing for no
That's
purpose.
Great. And when you recommend people to get started, is it a food quality plus food quantity issue, or do you just tell them to limit the carbs and eat a lot of fat and then transition into a paleo-ish style diet?
Yeah. So it depends on where they're coming from. If they're already paleo, it's a pretty easy transition. But if they're coming from a standard American diet, my approach with my clients and my programs is, okay, let's first understand what a fat and a carb is and what a good fat and a good carb is. Okay, now that you know that, let's set the intention over the next week to eat all of the good fats and a little bit of the good carbs, and just start there and then baby step it that way. Whereas there are other people that, like myself, if I want to do something, I want to do it yesterday, not 2 weeks from now. So just tell me what I need to do. I'll overhaul my entire life and get it done. So if you're that type of person, then it's here are the good fats, here are the bad fats, here are the, low carb vegetables that you want to shoot for. Don't do these things, on keto of the processed foods and all of those things. And even the sweeteners, and going so far as talking about that. And okay, your macros are this and do that. And some people thrive on that. So it really just depends. But I think the most important thing is setting a base of food quality. And, I always said when I was transitioning out of the really, really strict keto over to what I do now is I don't count my kale. If I want kale, I was that girl sitting at my food scale being like, oop, and then taking out a little leaf of kale and oh, perfect. That's 50 grams, So I think that can be quite detrimental.
Do you give people any recommendation on protein intake?
Oh, that's a good question. Some people react to protein. I don't know if you've seen this in your own practice, but I find that some people react to protein differently than others. Yeah, my husband, he can eat quite a lot of protein and stay in ketosis quite effortlessly. Whereas myself, if I eat too much, I just don't feel right and my ketones are massively reduced. So I like to just say, for the time being, when you first start off with keto, probably the best approach, if you want to keep it really easy, is your weight divided by 2 is how many grams you want to shoot for protein, just to sort of set a base. So if you weigh 150 pounds, then you would do 75 grams of protein. And that's kind of the place you would start. And I find the best place I can be with protein is 68 grams.
Exactly.
And that just took, 68 grams. Exactly. That is where it's best. But that, I've been doing this for 4 years. So, I tried 75, I tried 120, I went down to 50, and you just kind of get a feel for where you feel best. And for women, especially, and something that we haven't chatted about is it changes with where I'm at in my cycle. So I find that I need more protein when I am ovulating versus perhaps a couple of days before my period, whereas I need carbs at a certain time. So you also have to pay attention to where you're at in your cycle and whether or not your macros need to be shifted depending on where you're at with your cycle.
So one thing I like to ask all the guests on the show are how they approach each of the 4 pillars of health that I like to think of. 1, nutrition; 2, movement; and then the other is stress and sleep. So we talked a little bit, obviously you have 68 grams of protein that you get in a day. You do fasting intermittently whenever you feel like it, but what do typical meals look like for you? And then if you could get a tip or one thing that people can do to change their nutrition after you can mention what you go through?
Yeah. So for my meals, I usually fast in the morning. I'm not a big breakfast person. I never have been. And so when I switched over to keto, it was like, what do you mean? I don't need to eat breakfast anymore. This is sweet. So if I am, in interviews and I'm talking all day, like for example, today, if I do get a little bit hungry and I just don't have time, I'll usually do like a bone broth if I'm at home and I can. And then I start the day eating usually around 1 p.m. That's kind of where I find is the best time for me. And what all my meals look like when I'm eating solid food is basically like a bunch of greens cooked with some sort of fat and some sort of protein also cooked in fat with maybe like I do sometimes a little bit of pumpkin seeds on there. I really love the mixed greens like you get at Costco. And I just make big salads out of that and like drench it in olive oil with a little bit of pumpkin seeds. And I like chicken thighs. That's kind of my go-to. And I cook those up in coconut oil or whatever fat I have. And that's usually what I eat for lunch and dinner, some sort of variation of that. I try not to overthink it. It's, oftentimes when I share my pictures on Instagram of my food, people are like, do you have a recipe for that? I'm like, no, it's literally cauliflower with bacon and coconut oil. Like there is no recipe. Just put it in a pot, wait 5 minutes, eat it. I try to keep things really, really simple when it comes to meals. You mentioned movement. I like hiking. I realized I actually hate going to the gym. I don't like going to the gym. I don't like that experience. We live full time in our RV and we travel all over. So also finding a gym and dealing with that in new cities is just a headache. So instead, we hike every day and we find new places and we get out in nature. And I enjoy that. And I think for movement, it should be really important to find something that you love to do and that you enjoy doing. Therefore, you'll do more of it.
Yeah, that's the thing that you're going to do more of. Like you said, the stuff that you like to do is what you'll actually do.
Yeah, like today, I can't wait to finish all my calls so we can go climb a mountain. And I'm really excited because we're going to see new things and different rocks. And, we take breaks and we look at the different rocks and the different plants and I'm learning things and I'm Googling stuff like, why does this rock have this for me? I'm kind of geeky that way, but it's cool because you're learning and you're walking and you're going up a mountain or down a mountain or across the prairies or whatever you want to do. It's just nice to love what you do when it comes to the movement of your body. So that's one of the tips for movement. Do you want me to touch on stress and sleep?
And how you manage that? I think you mentioned a little bit before and how you approach that, but any other techniques that you use?
Yeah, stress. I like to do breathing exercises a lot. I am known for my breathing exercises. And that's just, if I'm feeling a little bit overwhelmed and I just need a moment, I'll close my eyes and count to 5 up and 5 down, and then 6 in and 6 out, and then 7 in and 7 out until I've kind of calmed myself. And counting your breaths in and out and increasing that way is something that I learned in yoga many, many years ago. And it's kind of just stuck with me. And that's usually all I need to kind of get out of a funk. And also stress is massively reduced with my movement practice. So I'm very good at being like, okay, I need to step away from my laptop right now. I need to go for a walk and just to move my body and get outside and get some sunshine. And also, setting up clear boundaries for myself and learning how to say no to people. That was a big one when it came to stress of like, you can't do everything. You don't want to do everything. Choose the things that you like doing. And, say no to the things you don't want to do. I don't want to, we're staying in the US right now. My family's in Canada. I don't want to fly up to Canada for the holidays with flights and family and food and all the things. I just want to, be quiet this year, and that's okay. And that's what you feel like doing. And a lot of people, I think, get anxious about making choices for themselves and feel like it's selfish, but you have to put yourself first so that you can show up bigger for the people that you really care about. So that's something that I've incorporated a lot.
Love it. How's the sleep been in the RV? Really?
It's great.
The stars,
it's
or what?
Great. Unless we Yeah, we've been doing a lot of that. I think, there are certain places where unfortunately you have to park on the side of a highway and it's really, really loud. We do not like staying in RV parks, which is where we are currently. So those are just louder. There's more people. We love boondocking, which is dry camping, where you just set up camp in the middle of nowhere and there's no humans, there's no nothing. And then sleep is just the best. It's the best sleep. It's amazing. And I think, as long as we don't watch TV too late or we're not working too late, then I usually have a good sleep. But I think it depends on, how you set up your evening. I really love having quiet time before we go to bed, where we're not really doing much of anything. Maybe we're playing a game, and just taking it easy. That can be a nice way to wind down. But yeah, it's been awesome in the RV.
Do you have a certain
sleeping.
amount of
It's
hours
great.
that you go for?
I don't really aim for anything. I think the main thing is just I really don't like setting an alarm, and I'm able to do that now that I work for myself. And it's taken a while, but my magic time is I go to bed around 10:45. I'm probably asleep by 11, and I wake up like at 7:30, 7:38, somewhere in there. And I don't set an alarm. I just wake up naturally. And so I find that that's kind of like my sweet spot. If you don't have the ability to set, to just sleep till when you want, something that I did when I was working is I just go to bed a little bit earlier until I woke up naturally at a certain amount of time. So you can kind of play the opposite game of, okay, well, if I go to bed at 9 o'clock, if my alarm goes off, am I already awake? Or if I go to bed at 8:30, when my alarm goes off, I'll be awake, and kind of play that game of, set your alarm, but try to make sure that you're up just before it goes off. So you can kind of play around and see what time it's best for you to wake up. But my time is like 7:30 to 7:38.
7:38, 68 grams of protein. Love it.
Yep. Yeah.
So your book and
great.
YouTube channel are one of the few places where I consistently recommend people to learn about the ketogenic diet. Is there anywhere else that you want to show people where your content lives, or anywhere to find anything else about you?
Yeah, so you can head on over to my blog, Healthful Pursuit, for kind of like all the podcasts, all the YouTube videos in one place. And my podcast name is The Keto Diet Podcast. I know, super original. And then you can get my book at any bookstore, really. And you can also get it on Amazon. It's bright, it's orange, it's in a lot of the Costco's too. So you can probably find it there. Yeah. And those are all the places. Also on Instagram. I love Instagram. It's just Healthful Pursuit. You could even search for like keto Leanne, I think.
Awesome.
And
Yeah,
you'll find
and your
just
podcast
fine.
again is just tremendous. I've been lucky enough to be on there a couple of times, and every time just such great questions and great community of people who listen to that show. So good work. Thank you so much for doing what you do and focusing on quality in a ketogenic diet. I think that's super important that a lot of people aren't doing now. And I know you have a busy schedule, so we'll get off the horn here, but happy to get on the phone with you, and we'll chat soon. Okay.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. Take care.
All right, everyone. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Keto Answers podcast. I hope you enjoyed it, but even if you didn't, I would love a review. Just go over to iTunes, wherever you listen to your podcasts, and pop in a review so we can get found by more people, get better guests, and have the information that you need. So please go to iTunes, wherever you listen to your podcasts, and leave us a review. And if you're new to keto, head on over to perfectketo.com/podcast and enter your email for all our top tips and guides on getting started with the ketogenic diet. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.